The mammoth killers. Did humans really wipe them out? The frozen earth of the Siberian tundra hides secrets that are tens of thousands of years old. Every summer, as the permafrost thaws, the ground gives up the ghosts of a lost world. Massive curved tusks, femurs the size of tree trunks, and tufts of coarse, reddish-brown hair emerge from the mud. These are the remains of the woolly mammoth, the iconic titan of the Ice Age. For thousands of years, these creatures dominated the northern hemisphere, ranging from the British Isles across the vast expanse of Siberia and over the Bering Land Bridge into North America. They were the lords of the Mammoth Steppe, a unique and productive ecosystem that vanished along with them. But their disappearance is one of science's most enduring cold cases. Roughly 10,000 years ago, the vast majority of these animals died out, leaving behind a planet that was warmer, wetter, and significantly emptier. The timing of their extinction coincides suspiciously with two major global events: the rapid warming of the climate at the end of the Pleistocene epoch, and the expansion of modern humans into the mammoths' territory. For decades, scientists have debated which of these forces was the executioner. Was it the changing weather that destroyed their habitat and starved them into oblivion? Or was it the arrival of a new, clever, and ruthless predator armed with fire and stone-tipped spears? This text explores the depths of the quaternary extinction event, examining the biology of the victim, the capabilities of the suspects, and the complex interplay of forces that brought down the giants of the Ice Age, the titan of the Ice Age. To understand why the mammoth went extinct, one must first understand what it was and how it lived. The woolly mammoth, or Mammuthus primigenius, was not the largest elephant species to ever live, contrary to popular belief. It was roughly the size of a modern African elephant, standing between 3 and roughly 3.5 meters tall at the shoulder, and weighing up to 6 tons. However, it was uniquely adapted to the cold. Its evolutionary history is a story of specialization. The mammoth lineage diverged from the Asian elephant roughly 6 million years ago. As the global climate cooled and the ice caps expanded, the ancestors of the woolly mammoth migrated out of Africa and into the northern latitudes. Over hundreds of thousands of years, natural selection sculpted them into the ultimate cold weather survival machines. The physical adaptations of the woolly mammoth were comprehensive. They possessed a multi-layered coat consisting of a dense, woolly undercoat and long, coarse guard hairs that could reach a meter in length. Beneath this thick pelt lay a layer of sebaceous glands that secreted grease to waterproof their fur. And under the skin was a layer of fat up to 10 centimeters thick, providing insulation and energy reserves. Their ears and tails were significantly smaller than those of modern elephants, a classic example of Allen's rule, which dictates that animals in cold climates evolve smaller extremities to minimize heat loss. Even their blood was adapted. Genetic studies have shown that mammoth hemoglobin had mutations that allowed it to release oxygen efficiently even at near-freezing temperatures, preventing their tissues from dying in the harsh Arctic winters. The mammoth was the keystone species of its environment. This environment, known as the Mammoth Steppe, was the world's most extensive biome during the Pleistocene. It stretched from Spain to Canada. Unlike the modern tundra, which is boggy, mossy, and relatively unproductive, the Mammoth Steppe was a cold, dry grassland. It was dominated by high-protein grasses, herbs, and sedges, supported by the dry soil and the constant trampling of megafauna. Mammoths acted as the engineers of this ecosystem. By knocking down trees and trampling moss, they prevented the forest from taking over and facilitated the growth of grasses. Their dung fertilized the soil, and their massive footprints created microhabitats for insects and smaller animals. They were highly social animals, likely living in matriarchal family groups similar to modern elephants, possessing high intelligence, long memories, and complex emotional lives. The crime scene. The late Pleistocene extinction. The extinction of the woolly mammoth was not an isolated event. It was part of a global phenomenon known as the Quaternary extinction event. Toward the end of the Pleistocene, specifically between 50,000 and 10,000 years ago, the world lost a staggering percentage of its large animals, or megafauna. In North America alone, roughly 35 genera of large mammals disappeared, including giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, camels, horses, and short-faced bears. In Eurasia, the losses were similar, though the timeline was more staggered. The woolly rhinoceros, the cave lion, and the Irish elk all vanished. The pattern of this extinction is highly specific. It targeted large terrestrial herbivores and the carnivores that preyed upon them. Small mammals, plants, insects, and marine life were largely unaffected. This specificity suggests a cause that disproportionately impacts creatures with large body sizes, slow reproduction rates, and high caloric requirements. The timing of these extinctions varies by continent, a fact that has become a crucial piece of evidence in the whodunit of the mammoth's demise. In Australia, the megafauna vanished around 45,000 years ago. In North America and South America, the collapse occurred much later, around 13,000 to 11,000 years ago. In Eurasia, the process was more gradual, a slow decline over thousands of years, culminating in a final collapse at the end of the Ice Age. This staggering of extinction dates is the primary weapon used by proponents of the human overkill hypothesis. If climate were the sole driver, one would expect simultaneous extinctions globally as the planet warmed. However, the extinctions seem to follow the footsteps of human migration. Australia lost its giants shortly after humans arrived by boat. The Americas lost their megafauna shortly after humans crossed the Bering Land Bridge. This correlation forms the backbone of the most contentious theory in paleontology. Suspect 1. The overkill hypothesis. In 1967, a visionary scientist named Paul Martin proposed a theory that shocked the scientific community. He called it the overkill hypothesis, often referred to as the Blitzkrieg model. Martin argued that the extinction of the megafauna was not caused by climate, but by the arrival of Homo sapiens. He depicted early humans not as struggling survivors huddled in caves, but as a super predator, the most efficient killing machine the Earth had ever seen. According to the Blitzkrieg model, when humans entered new territories like the Americas or Australia, they encountered animals that had never seen a human before. These animals were naive. Unlike the fauna of Africa and Eurasia, which had co-evolved with humans for millions of years and learned to fear them, the American and Australian megafauna had no instinctive fear of the small, bipedal apes. They would have stood their ground or approached out of curiosity, making them easy targets for hunters armed with projectile weapons. Martin calculated that a relatively small population of humans, expanding rapidly and killing efficiently, could wipe out the megafauna of an entire continent in less than 1,000 years. The wave of humanity would move forward like a consuming fire, leaving a wake of extinction behind it. The math seemed to work. Large animals like mammoths have long gestation periods, nearly 2 years, and require more than a decade to reach sexual maturity. If human hunters killed even a small percentage of the breeding adults, the population growth rate would drop below the replacement level. It wouldn't require mass slaughter in the sense of killing every animal in sight. It only required killing them slightly faster than they could reproduce. The weapon of choice for these hunters in North America was the Clovis point. Named after the town in New Mexico where they were first discovered, Clovis points are fluted stone projectiles, exquisitely crafted and razor-sharp. They appear in the archaeological record roughly 13,000 years ago, coinciding almost perfectly with the disappearance of the mammoth in North America. These points were often hafted onto spears that could be thrown with an atleter or spear thrower, increasing the range and velocity of the strike. Archaeologists have found direct evidence of this predation. There are over a dozen sites in North America where Clovis points have been found intimately associated with mammoth remains, sometimes embedded directly in the bone. The Nikkei site in Arizona, for example, contained a mammoth skeleton with 8 Clovis points lodged in its rib cage and skull. This is the smoking gun. We know humans hunted mammoths. However, proving that they hunted them to extinction is a different matter. Critics of the overkill hypothesis point out that 14 or 15 kill sites are statistically insignificant compared to the millions of mammoths that must have lived and died over millennia. They argue that if humans were wiping out millions of animals, we should find thousands of kill sites. Martin's defense was that the event happened so quickly, a geological blink of an eye, that the probability of fossilization and subsequent discovery is incredibly low. Suspect 2. The climate change hypothesis. While Paul Martin was formulating his blitzkrieg theory, other scientists were looking at the thermometer. The end of the Pleistocene was a time of chaotic climatic upheaval. The world was emerging from the last glacial maximum, the peak of the Ice Age. Temperatures were rising, glaciers were retreating, and sea levels were rising. But the transition was not smooth. It was punctuated by violent swings in temperature. The most significant of these oscillations was the Bowling-Allerod interstadial, a warm period that began roughly 14,700 years ago, followed by a sharp return to glacial cold known as the Younger Dryas roughly 12,900 years ago. The Younger Dryas lasted for over a millennium before the climate suddenly warmed again, marking the beginning of the Holocene, the stable epoch we live in today. Proponents of the climate change hypothesis argue that these rapid fluctuations shattered the ecosystem of the Mammoth Steppe. As the climate warmed and became wetter, the dry, grassy steppe was replaced by waterlogged tundra in the north and expanding forests in the south. Trees are the enemy of the mammoth. Mammoths require vast open spaces to graze. They cannot easily navigate dense forests, and the deep snow of the forest trapped them and made them vulnerable to starvation. Furthermore, the vegetation changed. The high-protein grasses that fueled the mammoth's massive metabolism were replaced by toxic birch shrubs and low-nutrient mosses. This theory posits that the mammoths died of nutritional stress and habitat fragmentation. As the steppe broke apart, mammoth populations were isolated in smaller and smaller pockets of suitable habitat. Small, isolated populations are vulnerable to local extinction events, disease, and inbreeding. The fossil record supports this to some degree. We see a reduction in the body size of mammoths in some regions towards the end of the Pleistocene, a classic sign of nutritional stress. We also see changes in their range, retreating northward as the forest expanded. A specific mechanism within the climate hypothesis is the idea of polutification. As the permafrost thawed and precipitation increased, the firm ground of the steppe turned into a bog. Mammoths, with their heavy bodies and small feet relative to their size, would have struggled to move through this marshy terrain. The energy costs of locomotion would have increased just as the quality of their food source was decreasing. It was a thermodynamic death trap. The synergistic hypothesis. As the debate raged for decades between the overkill camp and the climate camp, a third perspective began to emerge, one that acknowledges the complexity of ecological systems. This is the synergistic hypothesis. It suggests that neither humans nor climate acted alone. Instead, they formed a deadly combination, a perfect storm, that the mammoths could not survive. In this scenario, climate change was the initial stressor. The loss of the mammoth steppe fragmented the populations, reduced their numbers, and restricted their range. Under normal circumstances, the mammoth populations might have eventually recovered or adapted, as they had done during previous interglacial warm periods. The Pleistocene had seen many cycles of warming and cooling, and the mammoths had survived them all. Why was this time different? The difference was us. When humans arrived on the scene, they found a mammoth population that was already stressed and declining. The humans didn't need to be a super predator killing millions of healthy animals. They simply needed to apply additional pressure to a species that was already teetering on the brink. By hunting the remaining herds, disrupting their migration routes, and perhaps burning the landscape, humans prevented the mammoths from recovering. They delivered the coup de grace to a dying species. This explains why mammoths survived previous warm periods. In the Eemian interglacial, roughly 120,000 years ago, the world was even warmer than it is today, and forests covered much of Siberia. Yet the mammoths survived. They retreated to refugia and waited for the cold to return. But during the Eemian, there were no modern humans in Siberia or North America with sophisticated weaponry. When the Holocene warming arrived, the mammoths had nowhere to run where they wouldn't encounter a human hunter. The genetic revolution. In the 21st century, the debate was transformed by a new technology: ancient DNA. Scientists learned how to extract genetic material from preserved mammoth bones, teeth, and hair. This allowed them to reconstruct the population history of the species with unprecedented detail. The genetic data revealed some surprising truths that complicated the narrative. First, the DNA showed that mammoth populations were dynamic. They expanded and contracted significantly over the millennia in rhythm with the climate long before humans arrived. This lends credibility to the climate hypothesis. However, the DNA also revealed that mammoth genetic diversity plummeted as the extinction event approached. One of the most profound discoveries came from the study of the last stands. While mainland mammoths went extinct roughly 10,000 years ago, two isolated populations survived much longer on islands that were cut off from the mainland by rising sea levels. One population lived on St. Paul Island in the Bering Sea until 5,600 years ago. The other lived on Wrangel Island in the Arctic Ocean until an astonishing 4,000 years ago. This means that mammoths were still walking the earth when the Great Pyramid of Giza was being built. The Wrangel Island mammoths provide a fascinating case study. Genetic analysis of these final survivors showed that they were plagued by a, quote, genomic meltdown. Because they were isolated on a small island with a small population, they were forced to inbreed. Deleterious mutations accumulated in their genome. They lost their ability to smell flowers, essential for choosing food. Their coats may have become translucent or strange in texture, and their male fertility likely plummeted. However, the existence of the Wrangel mammoths also argues against the climate being the sole killer. Wrangel Island had the same climate as the nearby Siberian mainland. If the climate killed the mainland mammoths 10,000 years ago, why did the Wrangel mammoths survive for another 6,000 years? The answer is likely the absence of humans. Wrangel Island was uninhabited by humans until just a few hundred years after the last mammoth died. The moment humans arrived, the mammoths were gone. Or perhaps, the mammoths finally succumbed to their genetic defects, or a sudden weather event just before humans arrived. The timing is agonizingly close. The St. Paul Island population tells a different story. Research published in 2016 suggests they died of thirst. As the sea levels rose, the island shrank, and the freshwater lakes were contaminated by saltwater intrusion. This is a clear case of environmental extinction, independent of humans. The human role in Eurasia versus North America. The story of extinction differs by continent. In North America, the arrival of the Clovis people and the extinction of the megafauna are tightly synchronized. This strong temporal correlation makes the overkill hypothesis particularly compelling for the Americas. The Clovis first model, which posited that Clovis people were the first humans in the Americas, held sway for decades. However, recent archaeological finds at sites like Monte Verde in Chile and the Galt site in Texas have pushed back the arrival of humans by thousands of years. If humans were in the Americas 15,000 or 16,000 years ago, why did the mammoths survive until 13,000 years ago? Overkill proponents argue that the pre-Clovis populations were too small to have an impact. It wasn't until the invention or arrival of the Clovis point technology and the population boom associated with it that the slaughter began. In Eurasia, the situation is even more complex. Humans, including Neanderthals and modern Homo sapiens, had coexisted with mammoths for tens of thousands of years. We have evidence of Neanderthals butchering mammoths, and later, the Gravettian culture of modern humans, roughly 30,000 to 20,000 years ago, built spectacular dwellings out of mammoth bones. In Ukraine and Russia, archaeologists have uncovered huts constructed from hundreds of mammoth mandibles and tusks. If humans were such efficient killers, why didn't they wipe out the Eurasian mammoths 40,000 years ago? One argument is that the Eurasian mammoths had co-evolved with hominids and were wary of them. Another is that the human population densities in the harsh Siberian environment were simply too low to threaten the vast herds. The extinction in Eurasia was a slow, patchy retreat, not a sudden blitzkrieg. This supports the idea that climate was the primary driver in Eurasia, slowly eroding the habitat, while humans acted as a persistent, low-level predator that prevented recovery. The role of fire and landscape modification. Humans possess a weapon far more powerful than the spear: fire. There is evidence that Paleolithic peoples used fire to manage landscapes. By burning forests and brush, they could encourage the growth of fresh grass to attract game. However, extensive burning can also alter ecosystems permanently. Some researchers suggest that human-induced fires contributed to the conversion of the Mammoth Steppe into less palatable vegetation types. In Australia, the extinction of megafauna is closely linked to changes in fire regimes. In the northern hemisphere, the evidence is less clear, but the ability of humans to alter the environment on a large scale cannot be discounted. The hyperdisease hypothesis. A minor but persistent theory is the hyperdisease hypothesis. This idea suggests that humans, or the dogs that accompanied them, introduced a virulent new disease to the Americas that the naive megafauna had no immunity to. Something like a mammoth plague could explain the rapid die-off without requiring mass slaughter. While biologically plausible, we have seen similar events in modern times, such as the chytrid fungus wiping out amphibians. There is currently no direct evidence for such a disease in the fossil record. No mass graves with pathological signs of infection have been found. It remains a theoretical possibility but lacks the smoking gun of the overkill or climate theories. The Younger Dryas impact theory. In 2007, a controversial new theory entered the arena: the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. A group of scientists proposed that a fragmented comet or asteroid struck the Earth roughly 12,900 years ago, primarily over the Laurentide ice sheet in North America. The impact, they argued, caused massive wildfires, blocked the sun with ash, and triggered the sudden cooling of the Younger Dryas. This cataclysm would have wiped out the megafauna instantly, or through the subsequent environmental collapse. The evidence for this theory includes a black matte layer in the geological record containing nanodiamonds, magnetic spherules, and high concentrations of platinum and iridium, materials often associated with cosmic impacts. This layer is found at over 50 sites across North America and Europe, right at the boundary of the extinction event. Critics of the impact theory are numerous. They argue that the nanodiamonds and spherules can be formed by non-impact processes or are misidentified. They point out that there is no distinct crater dated to this time, though proponents argue it struck the ice shield, leaving no traditional crater. Despite the controversy, the theory refuses to die and provides a dramatic third option that exonerates humans. If a comet killed the mammoths, then the Clovis hunters were merely scavengers picking over the bones of a planetary disaster. However, as of the current scientific consensus, the impact theory is considered less likely than the combination of climate and human hunting, but it remains an active area of research. The ecological aftermath, the broken web. The extinction of the mammoth had profound consequences for the Earth. We often think of the environment shaping the animals, but animals also shape the environment. The mammoth was a geoengineer. By knocking down trees, they maintained the albedo, reflectivity, of the Arctic. Grasslands reflect more sunlight than dark forests. When the mammoths vanished, the forests marched north, darkening the land and absorbing more heat, which accelerated global warming. Furthermore, the loss of the megafauna broke the nutrient cycle. Large animals transport nutrients from nutrient-rich areas to nutrient-poor areas through their dung. They move phosphorus and nitrogen across vast distances. When they died, this pump stopped. The landscape became more static, less fertile. The methane emissions of millions of fermenting mammoth guts ceased, which ironically might have caused a slight dip in greenhouse gases, though this was overwhelmed by other factors. The ghost plants of the Americas are another legacy. Trees like the Osage orange, the Kentucky coffee tree, and the honey locust produce large fruits or pods that seem ill-adapted for dispersal by modern animals. They were evolved to be eaten by megafauna like mammoths and ground sloths, who would pass the seeds intact. Today, these plants are ecological anachronisms, waiting for ghosts to eat their fruit. Synthesis, the verdict. So, did humans really wipe them out? The answer is rarely black and white in science. The weight of the evidence points to a nuanced verdict. In North America, the human fingerprint is strongest. The arrival of the Clovis hunters coincides too perfectly with the collapse of the megafauna to be a coincidence. The climate was changing, yes, but the animals had survived similar changes before. The addition of a new, lethal predator was the tipping point. It is highly probable that human hunting was the decisive factor in the Americas, potentially pushing populations that were already stressed by climate over the edge. In Eurasia, the verdict leans more heavily toward climate. The extinction was slower, tracking the retreat of the steppe vegetation. Humans contributed, certainly, by preventing recolonization and adding mortality to the mix. But the loss of the biome seems to be the primary driver. The last stands on the islands prove that without humans and without habitat loss, initially, mammoths could survive into the mid-Holocene. This reinforces the idea that the mainland extinction was not inevitable. It was contingent on the specific intersection of rapid warming and human expansion. Therefore, the most accurate conclusion is that the woolly mammoth was the victim of a conspiracy. The climate destroyed their fortress, the Mammoth Steppe, forcing them into retreat. Humans then intercepted the refugees, cutting off their escape routes and slaughtering the survivors. We may not have been the sole cause, but we were almost certainly the final nail in the coffin. We turned a difficult situation for the mammoth into an impossible one. The future. De-extinction. The story of the mammoth may not be over. In recent years, the concept of de-extinction has moved from science fiction to serious scientific pursuit. Organizations like Colossal Biosciences are actively working on using CRISPR gene editing technology to splice mammoth DNA into the genome of the Asian elephant. Their goal is to create a mammothant, a cold-resistant elephant that functions ecologically like a mammoth. The stated goal of this project is not just to bring back a cool animal for zoos, but to restore the Mammoth Steppe. Proponents argue that reintroducing herds of these creatures to the Arctic could help trample the moss, knock down the encroaching shrubs, and restore the grasslands. This, they claim, could help seal the permafrost and slow down climate change. It is a bold, controversial, and ethically complex vision. Critics argue that the ecosystem has moved on. The Mammoth Steppe is gone. Reintroducing a proxy species might cause unforeseen ecological damage. Furthermore, the money spent on de-extinction could be better used to save existing species that are currently on the brink of extinction. Species that are being driven out by the same force that helped kill the mammoth, human activity. Conclusion: the woolly mammoth was a masterpiece of evolution, a creature perfectly adapted to a world of ice and grass. Its demise was a tragedy of timing. It was caught between the hammer of a warming world and the anvil of human ingenuity. The debate over who killed the mammoth is more than an academic exercise. It is a reflection on our own nature. Are we inherently destroyers, the ecological serial killers that Paul Martin described? Or are we merely one part of a complex web of life, subject to the same forces of nature as the beasts we hunt? The evidence suggests we are both. We are capable of immense destruction, often inadvertently or through the simple necessity of survival. But we are also the only species capable of looking back at the fossil record, understanding our impact, and debating the morality of our actions. We killed the mammoth, in part, but we are also the only ones who remember it, who study it, and who dream of bringing it back. The bones in the permafrost are a warning from the past. They remind us that no species is invincible, that climates can change with brutal speed, and that our actions echo through the millennia. As we face the biodiversity crisis of the Anthropocene, the sixth extinction, the lesson of the mammoth is more relevant than ever. We are no longer the small bands of hunters with stone spears. We are a geological force. The question is no longer whether we can wipe out species. We know we can. The question is whether we can stop. Chapter 1. The World Before. To fully appreciate the magnitude of the loss, we must immerse ourselves in the Pleistocene epoch. This was not a barren wasteland of uninterrupted snow. The Mammoth Steppe was a biome without a modern analog. It was a high-productivity environment. Imagine a horizon stretching infinitely, not covered in deep snow, but in dry, golden grasses, sagebrush, and wildflowers during the short but intense summer. The sun would circle the sky without setting for months, fueling a burst of photosynthesis. The fauna that inhabited this world was staggering. It wasn't just mammoths. There were herds of steppe bison numbering in the millions. There were wild horses, small and sturdy. There were reindeer, saiga antelope with their bulbous noses, and muskoxen. Predating on them were the cave lions, larger than modern African lions, and the scimitar-toothed cats. The short-faced bear, a monster that stood on two legs to peer over the trees, scavenged and hunted across the landscape. The woolly mammoth was the anchor of this guild. They were the bulldozers. By uprooting trees, they kept the canopy open. This allowed sunlight to hit the ground, encouraging the growth of grasses. Grasses, unlike mosses or pine needles, decay quickly and return nutrients to the soil. The mammoth's digestive system was inefficient. It excreted roughly half of what it ate largely undigested. This meant their dung was a high-quality fertilizer that essentially pre-composted the vegetation for the soil. A landscape with mammoths was a landscape of rapid nutrient cycling. This ecosystem relied on the cold. The dry, cold air prevented the accumulation of deep snow. Mammoths can shovel away some snow with their tusks and trunks, but they cannot feed in 2 meters of powder. The steppe relied on aridity. When the climate warmed, the air held more moisture. Snowfall increased. The soil became boggy. The grasses drowned, replaced by acidic mosses that offered little nutrition. The biological productivity of the Arctic collapsed. This backdrop of environmental decay is the stage upon which the human actors made their entrance. Chapter 2. The Anatomy of the Hunt. If humans did contribute to the extinction, how did they do it? A mammoth is a formidable adversary. A 6-ton animal can crush a human with ease. It has thick skin, fur, and fat, protecting its vital organs. A simple spear thrust might annoy it, but rarely kill it instantly. Experimental archaeology and the study of modern elephant hunting by indigenous peoples give us clues. The Clovis point was a breakthrough in weapons technology. The fluting, a groove chipped out of the base, allowed it to be hafted securely onto a split shaft. This meant the point wouldn't fall off upon impact. The stone used was often high-quality chert or obsidian, flaked to a molecularly sharp edge, sharper than surgical steel. Hunters likely used strategy over brute force. They would target solitary animals, perhaps young males who had left the matriarchal herd or old individuals. They might have used terrain traps, driving the mammoth into a swamp, a pit, or deep snow where its mobility was compromised. Once immobilized, the hunters could close in and target the soft underbelly or the area behind the ribs to puncture the lungs or heart. Wounded animals might be tracked for days until they succumbed to blood loss or infection. The investment of energy to kill a mammoth was high, but the payoff was astronomical. A single mammoth provided tons of meat, fat for fuel, crucial in a treeless landscape, bone for tools and housing, and hides for clothing. It was a walking supermarket. This high value made them a preferred target. The optimal foraging theory suggests that predators will target the highest ranked prey, most calories for least effort, as long as they are available. Mammoths, despite the danger, were high-ranked because of the massive return. But was this sustainable? Modeling suggests that human hunter-gatherers reproduce exponentially when resources are abundant. As they moved into the Americas, they found a land of plenty. Their population would have doubled every generation. As the human population soared, the pressure on the megafauna would have intensified. Even if they didn't rely solely on mammoths, the opportunistic killing of juveniles would have devastated the slow-breeding population. Chapter 3. The detailed timeline of collapse. Let us scrutinize the dates. In the Taimyr Peninsula of Siberia, mammoths were abundant 45,000 years ago. We see a dip in their numbers during the last glacial maximum, roughly 25,000 to 19,000 years ago, because the extreme cold actually reduced the productivity of the steppe. As the world warmed up after the LGM, mammoth populations rebounded. Then came the Bowling Alarod warming, 14,700 years ago. This was a shock to the system. Forests expanded rapidly. We see mammoth ranges fragmenting. Then the younger Dryas cold snap hit, 12,900 years ago. Paradoxically, this return to cold might have temporarily helped the mammoths by reopening the steppe. But the climatic whiplash was severe. It is exactly in this chaotic window, between 14,000 and 10,000 years ago, that the extinction happens. In North America, the Clovis culture appears roughly 13,500 years ago and vanishes roughly 12,800 years ago. The mammoths disappear with them. The coincidence is so precise that it defies random chance. However, in Alaska, eastern Beringia, mammoths seem to have persisted a bit longer than in the lower 48 states. This is interesting because humans were in Alaska before they were in the rest of the Americas, waiting for the ice corridor to open. If humans were the sole killers, why did Alaskan mammoths survive longer? Perhaps the lower population density of humans in the north or the persistence of better habitat played a role. In Europe, the extinction is much earlier in the west and later in the east. Mammoths were gone from Britain by 14,000 years ago. They lingered in the Baltic until nearly the end of the Pleistocene. They held on in Siberia the longest. This east-west gradient does not perfectly match the spread of humans, who were everywhere, but it does match the retreat of the steppe climate, which persisted longer in the continental interior of Siberia. Chapter 4. The Isotopic Evidence. Science has moved beyond just looking at bones. We can now look inside the bones. Stable isotope analysis of carbon and nitrogen in mammoth collagen tells us what they were eating. Studies of mammoths from across Europe and Siberia show a distinct shift in diet leading up to the extinction. In the thousands of years prior to the collapse, isotope levels indicate a decrease in the quality of forage. They were eating more woody plants and fewer nutrient-dense grasses. Nitrogen-15 levels, which can indicate physiological stress or changes in soil aridity, often spike in the final millennia. Furthermore, analysis of tusk growth rings, which grow like tree rings, reveals the life history of individual animals. We can see the season of death. We can see years of slow growth due to starvation. In some late-stage populations, we see a decrease in the age of weaning. Young mammoths were being weaned earlier or growing faster, a phenomenon sometimes seen in populations under heavy hunting pressure, the live fast, die young response, though it can also result from high resource abundance in a recovering population. The signals are mixed, but the stress of the changing environment is chemically etched into their tusks. A particularly interesting study from the Yukagir mammoth found frozen in Siberia showed that it was not starving when it died. It had a stomach full of grass and willow. This animal died suddenly. However, at the population level, the trend toward nutritional stress is evident in many regions. Chapter 5. The counter-arguments to overkill. It is important to give the climate-only camp their full due. They argue that the blitzkrieg is physically impossible. They point to the African parallel. Humans and elephants coexist in Africa today. Why didn't we wipe them out? Overkill proponents argue this is because of coevolution. African elephants learned to be wary. But climate proponents argue that hunting technology in the Pleistocene wasn't advanced enough to wipe out a species across 2 continents. They also point to the emptiness of the archaeological record. If humans killed millions of mammoths, where are the kill sites? In Africa, we have thousands of sites showing butchery of smaller animals, but very few for elephants. Maybe humans rarely hunted them because it was too dangerous. Maybe they only scavenged natural deaths. Furthermore, the naive fauna hypothesis is criticized. Many animals have an instinctive fear of strange shapes or predators. Would a mammoth really just stand there and let a human walk up to it? Or would it charge? A charging mammoth is a terrified prospect for a hunter with a stone spear. There is also the issue of the bison. Bison migrated to North America around the same time as humans, or slightly before. They survived the extinction event and thrived, numbering in the tens of millions until the 19th century. Why did the bison survive the super predators while the mammoth died? Overkill proponents argue that bison reproduce faster and mature quicker than mammoths, allowing them to sustain higher hunting pressure. Bison also graze on shorter grasses that persisted better in the Holocene than the mammoth-specific forage. Chapter 6. The Role of the Younger Dryas. The Younger Dryas period deserves a closer look. This 200-year return to glacial conditions was likely triggered by a massive influx of fresh water into the North Atlantic from the melting ice sheets, which shut down the Gulf Stream. For the mammoths, this was a double-edged sword. The cold was good for them, but the variability was not. The climate didn't just get cold, it became unstable. Dust storms increased. The predictable seasonal cycles that migratory animals rely on were disrupted. If a herd migrated north, expecting summer grass, and found a blizzard, the entire generation of calves could die. If the impact theory is true, the Younger Dryas was initiated by a cataclysm. The airbursts would have ignited wildfires across the continent. The biomass burning layer found in the soil suggests up to 10% of the Earth's biomass might have burned. This would have destroyed the food supply for years. Large animals cannot just wait out a famine, they need huge amounts of food daily. A nuclear winter scenario, even a mild one, would be devastating to megafauna. However, the lack of a definitive crater and the localized nature of some evidence keeps this theory in the, quote, possible but unproven category. Chapter 7. The Genetics of Inbreeding, the Mutational Meltdown. The concept of mutational meltdown is crucial for understanding the final phase. When a population drops below a certain size, the effective population size, natural selection stops working efficiently. In a large population, bad mutations are weeded out because the individuals carrying them are outcompeted. In a small population, chance plays a bigger role. An individual with a bad mutation might breed simply because there is no one else. Over generations, these slightly harmful mutations accumulate. This is genetic load. The Wrangel Island mammoths had lost significant portions of their olfactory receptors, smell, and had mutations affecting the structure of their hair, the FOXQ1 gene. They likely suffered from reduced sperm count. This provides a mechanism for how a small population, perhaps reduced by human hunting or climate, eventually spirals into nothingness without needing to be killed off to the very last individual. It's a death by 1,000 cuts at the DNA level. This supports the synergistic model. Humans/climate reduce the population equals greater than isolation equals greater than inbreeding equals greater than extinction. Chapter 8. Comparative extinctions. Australia and Madagascar. To verify the human impact, we look elsewhere. Australia lost its giant kangaroos, wombats and lizards, megalania, around 45,000 years ago. The climate was changing, but not dramatically. The one major variable was the arrival of Aboriginal ancestors. The consensus in Australia is strongly in favor of human agency, primarily through fire stick farming, burning the bush, and hunting. Madagascar is an even clearer case. The giant lemurs and elephant birds survived until incredibly recently, about 2,000 years ago. They vanished exactly when humans arrived. The climate had been stable. This is a closed case. Humans did it. New Zealand is the final nail. The moa, giant flightless birds, were hunted to extinction by the Maori within a few hundred years of arrival in the 13th century. These island and continental comparisons establish a pattern. When humans arrive, large, slow-breeding animals disappear. It forces the burden of proof onto those who claim the mammoth was an exception. Why would the mammoth be the only megafauna not killed by the apex predator that wiped out the moa, the elephant bird, and the diprotodon? Chapter 9. The ghost DNA in the soil. A revolutionary new technique involves sampling soil from the tundra and sequencing the environmental DNA, eDNA, found within it. You don't need a bone, you just need dirt where an animal peed or decomposed. Recent eDNA studies published in 2021 suggested that mammoths might have survived in mainland Siberia much longer than we thought, perhaps as late as 3,900 years ago in some remote valleys. If true, this radically changes the picture. It suggests that small pockets of mammoths coexisted with humans for thousands of years in the Holocene. This resilience supports the idea that they weren't fragile flowers that died at the first sign of warmth. It implies they were hanging on, hiding in the vastness of the north, until something finally finished them off. It makes the quote-quote decline model more plausible than the sudden blitzkrieg. However, these eDNA dates are still being debated and verified. Chapter 10. The Cultural Memory. Do we remember them? There are no written records, but there might be oral ones. Some indigenous tribes in North America have legends of giant stiff-legged bears or monsters that resemble elephants. While difficult to verify as historical fact, these myths might be echoes of the Clovis era. In Europe, we have something better than myths: art. The cave paintings at Rouffignac, Chauvet, and Lascaux depict mammoths with stunning realism. We see their high-domed heads, their sloping backs, the finger-like projection on their trunks. These artists watched these animals. They respected them. The intimacy of the art suggests a deep connection. The humans who painted the caves were not just mindless killers. They were observers of nature. But reverence does not preclude consumption. We revere the tuna, yet we fish it to the brink. Chapter 11. The Final Synthesis. We return to the central question. Did humans wipe them out? The answer is a qualified yes. Without humans, the mammoths would likely have survived the Holocene warming. They had done it before. Their range would have shrunk. They would have retreated to the high Arctic islands and the northernmost tips of Siberia, and they would have waited for the next ice age. The population would have been stressed, but likely viable. Humans acted as the, quote, extinction filter. As the climate squeezed the mammoths into smaller areas, humans were waiting there. We blocked their migration corridors. We hunted the breeding stock. We burned the landscape. We turned a population bottleneck into a dead end. It was not a war. It was not a malicious campaign of extermination. It was thousands of years of hungry families trying to survive the winter. A mammoth kill meant life for the tribe. It meant heat, food, and shelter. The tragedy of the commons played out on a continental scale. No single hunter killed the last mammoth thinking, "This is the end." They just threw the spear because they were hungry. The extinction of the mammoth is a lesson in the power of incremental impacts. A small increase in mortality, sustained over millennia, can bring down a giant. It serves as a somber prologue to the Anthropocene. We have been altering the biosphere since we first learned to knap flint and carry fire. The mammoth was our first great casualty, but it was not our last. As we look at the empty tundra today, we see a landscape that is missing its soul. The silence of the steppe is the silence of a vanished king. Whether by the spear, the fire, or the changing wind, the mammoth is gone. But in the laboratories of geneticists and the trenches of archaeologists, the giant still speaks, telling us the story of how the modern world was made in fire, ice, and blood. Chapter 12. The Aftermath and the Future of the Arctic. The loss of the mammoth transformed the Arctic. Without the grazers, the Mammoth Steppe was replaced by the wet, acidic tundra we see today. This change has implications for our current climate fight. The modern tundra traps heat. The dark shrubs absorb solar radiation. The lack of trampling allows the snow to insulate the permafrost, preventing the winter cold from penetrating deep into the ground to freeze it solid. This creates a feedback loop. Warmer ground melts more permafrost, releasing methane. which warms the climate further. Sergei Zimov, a Russian scientist, created Pleistocene Park in Siberia to test this. He introduced bison, horses, and oxen to mimic the mammoth ecosystem. The results showed that the animals compacted the snow, chilling the ground and preserving the permafrost. They also encouraged the growth of reflective grasses. This suggests that the mammoth was not just an animal, it was a guardian of the ice. By killing the mammoth, we inadvertently broke the cooling mechanism of the north. The de-extinction efforts by Colossal and others are motivated by this ecological logic. If we can bring back the mammoth, or a functional proxy, can we restore the steppe? Can we use the resurrected giants to fight global warming? It is a poetic idea, using the ghost of the animal we helped destroy to save us from the consequences of our own industrial expansion. Whether it will work remains to be seen, but it highlights that the story of the mammoth is not just history. It is a living, breathing part of our future. The mammoth killers may yet become the mammoth creators. Chapter 13. Conclusion. The investigation into the mammoth's demise reveals the intricate dance between life and the planet. It was not a simple murder mystery. It was a complex tragedy involving the sun, the orbit of the Earth, the currents of the ocean, and the rise of a clever ape. The evidence, the fluted points in the ribs, the charcoal layers in the soil, the genetic decay in the DNA, paints a picture of a species besieged on all sides. We must accept our role. We are the mammoth killers. But we are also the species capable of understanding that fact. We're the only species that can mourn what we have lost. And perhaps we are the only species that can learn from it. The mammoth is gone, but its lesson remains. We are powerful. We are dangerous. And we are responsible for the garden we have been given.